Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. On this show, we discuss all aspects of executive compensation. Whether you're a compensation committee member, a seasoned compensation professional, or just curious to learn more about executive compensation, then this show is the answer. Each episode brings you a focused and actionable interview on specific topics of executive compensation. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com.
Just giving me a high-level overview of your thoughts on ESG and incorporating those metrics and incentive plans.
Yeah, I would just start out by saying that ESG has been the hot topic for many institutional investors, becoming increasingly important for proxy advisors through various scorecards that they're creating. And clearly it's becoming a priority for our clients who are taking a large initiative to come out with sustainability reports and really talking to their investors more clearly and more directly about where they stand on various ESG topics, but also where they're headed and the progress that they're making on ESG. And so I think that this area has gained traction, and I think it's gained importance because I think that companies are realizing that this is something that ultimately will add value to stakeholders, whether or not that's shareholders specifically or broader stakeholders like the community, the environment, and their constituents of their employee base. I think that they all believe that this will create lasting value in some way. The question for us as compensation professionals is, do you pay for that? And if so, how do you pay for that? Because we all have an inclination to want to pay for every initiative that we're trying to drive towards. And there's a push to start to include ESG in executive compensation arrangements, because really one of the more visible spots to disclose what's important to a company is through the proxy statement, through how you pay your top executives. And how important can it be if you're not paying for it is really the question.
Okay, awesome. I like that. And yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense here. And so I guess, what are you seeing in the market in terms of what people are talking about or how your clients are thinking about actually this idea of paying for ESG metrics? What is happening in the market at the moment?
Yeah, I would say that one of our challenges, Jake, is that everything we see in the market is really backward looking. As we sit here today in February, we're all working off of proxy statements from early 2020, before COVID, before all the social unrest last year. And we're really looking at programs for 2019. And even as we move the clock forward another month or two and we see the new proxy statements come out, we're going to be seeing a lot about what companies did in 2020 in a reactionary mode to the impact of COVID-19 on their business and their financials and their stock price. Companies are now really spending time in the boardroom and among their management teams thinking about, what do we want this to look like going forward? And that's not necessarily a required disclosure for 21, even if they put it in the programs. So we're constantly in this world where we're looking backwards, but companies are trying to move forward. And so really the question, what are our clients talking about, and how are we having these conversations in the boardroom, and what do we see as priorities being brought up by both management and the board members, and how do we then figure out how to advise our clients on how to incorporate it, if at all, because it's not an easy thing to incorporate despite it being seemingly.
Okay, that makes sense. And how are you seeing companies looking at incorporating ESG, or what are your thoughts or kind of recommendations as companies start to try to incorporate this into incentive plans?
Yeah, I think that companies are starting with the premise that if it belongs in the compensation program, they start out by saying that maybe it belongs in the annual incentive or cash-based incentive program. Why is that? That's because a lot of companies have multiple metrics. They tend to look at the annual incentive as a basket of metrics, some tied to financial, some tied to operational, some tied to strategic. And I think that they naturally think ESG is in the strategic bucket of items that you pay for in an annual incentive program. Plus it's cash-based. So there's a little bit more flexibility with how you deal with these metrics and how you can set goals that are meaningful and maybe measurable, but you can still have a little bit more subjectivity and a little bit more discretion on how you rate the performance of those. That being said, how much can you move the needle on an ESG and specifically some of the S items like diversity and inclusion or representation, how much can you really move the needle in a 12-month period, or really even a 10-month period by the time most companies set goals for the year? And as I think about this topic, I think that this is a journey, not a one-year destination. This is not about maximizing EPS in a year or finding cost reduction in a year. This is about making meaningful change to how you function as an organization, how you introduce new policies and practices for interviewing candidates, for getting the right slate of candidates. It's meaningful change in terms of how you include your current workforce and future workforce and how they feel like they're part of the organization. It's also not just about entry-level candidates. It's also about making sure that there's opportunities for people of color or minorities to move throughout the organization, to have the right opportunities for advancement, so that ultimately the C-suite, the CEO's direct reports, and even the CEO themselves can be filled with diverse candidates who are qualified. And that stuff takes time. That's not a 12-month endeavor. It's probably not even a 36-month endeavor. It's probably longer than that, but we're still working in the confines of our programs that we do as compensation professionals. I'd probably go one step further, Jake, to say that therefore I think the long-term incentive is probably the right place if you're really thinking about the change that needs to happen and the length of time it's going to take to actually make meaningful change and progress. The problem is that most of those clients that we deal with that are publicly traded grant those in equity. And with equity, there's just a different set of constraints in terms of what you can grant and the specificity that you need for the goals in order to make them true equity-based instruments. That will require us to set goals, meaningful goals for a 36-month period that doesn't have a lot of discretion or subjectivity built into them. And so companies really are tasked with the challenge of figuring out what are they trying to drive for? What do they want to measure? What's the baseline for which to measure success? How to set a goal that makes sense 3 years from now when we're constantly evolving and changing and this is also fresh, and making it meaningful for their constituents and their participants. These are not easy questions to answer.
That's great. And so what would you say would be some of the pitfalls that people should look out for when they are setting their metrics around or their incentive plans around ESG?
Yeah, two in particular come to mind, Jake, and I don't profess to be an attorney, but I think that there is probably some legal risk with any sort of metric based on diversity and inclusion that I can think of in terms of, are there plaintiffs' counsels out there who might come after you for bad practices, even though your intent is really good? You want to make change, you want to note that you're making meaningful change. Does that mean that you were doing it bad to begin with? Is there some risk there about disclosing what the bar was versus where you're trying to go? And even where you're trying to go, is that good enough? Is that keeping up with the market? Is that keeping up with your industry and your peers? Is that keeping up with where the macro environment is heading and where people want to be on that? And so I think that there's some real risk on the goal setting side and looking about where you're starting from and where you're going. I think the other risk is just if you take what I said for face value, that this is a better long-term metric. If you go one step further and say, what do normal or typical long-term incentive plans do? They typically have rolling cycles. We have built these things these days to work off of 3-year periods where you're setting new 3-year goals every year. We don't change the metrics very often. If you're picking return on capital or EPS or TSR, that's your metric generally for a period of time, but you're resetting the bar on what the next 3-year cycle looks like. How does that work in ESG? How does that work with a diversity and inclusion goal? Am I constantly going to reset the bar based on how well I did last year or how badly I missed last year? Am I going to have 3 sets of inclusion goals? What does that even look like? This is not an EPS or ROIC. This is not a standard benchmarkable item. And so I've really been giving this a lot of thought, Jake, and I think that what I might do or recommend for my clients is carve out the appropriate portion of the long-term incentive that you want to tie to ESG, which is a broad category. Maybe that's 20%, maybe that's 25, maybe it's 50. I don't know the right answer. But I would think of it differently. Instead of trying to reset the goal every year, I might think of it as, I know that I have a fixed portion tied to ESG. Each year, I'm going to pick what's the right focal area for the next 3 years in that entire bucket of ESG. 1 year, it might be an E. It might be carbon emissions. It might be some environmental metric. It might be a long-term safety metric if that's really important to a certain industry or business. The next year, it might be an S goal. It might be a diversity and inclusion. It might be how I change my practices and my hiring practices and my interview strategy. The next year, it might be a G goal. And by doing it that way, it gets you out of the rhythm of having to constantly have multiple goals that overlap and that aren't aligned with one another, and instead says ESG is a fundamental part of our program, but every 3-year period, we're going to pick a new focal area, and all of them are important, but we're going to really keep them a little bifurcated, which is going to help the participant understand what our real objective is for the next 36 months.
I love that. That's great. And yeah, I think you hit on just a bit there, but any other thoughts on how companies should prioritize or pick their metrics for ESG?
Yeah, that's a big challenge too, isn't it? There's so much that we want to change in company, and there's so much that's being touted as important. How do you pick the right singular metric to focus on? Because we don't want to have a watered down program where we have 10 different things in ESG and it's a basket of initiatives and none of them actually are really important. How do you pick the one singular metric that's going to really drive meaningful change? I don't know that's an easy task to solve, Jake, certainly on this interview. I think companies really have to take an inward look at themselves as an organization and try to identify, A, what problem are we trying to fix? And B, if we fix it, do we think that's going to really create meaningful stakeholder value? Now, I say stakeholders very carefully here. Our programs as public companies tend to focus on shareholders, and I don't discount the fact that they are one of our largest constituents that we have to be aware of. But I think that this goes to the greater good of stakeholders and enterprise value more than just stock price creation. And so I think that if a company can actually take the time to identify what meaningful change will result in enterprise value creation, whether that's diversity of thought, whether that's more creativity, whether that's the opportunity to get into other lines of business or get new customers that you didn't otherwise have access to, I think that's the type of metric that should be chosen to align with that larger initiative of creating value. And if they can figure that one out, then I think we got the right metric. We still have the problem of what's the right goal, but at least then we can get one step further in this.
Awesome. This is great. Yeah. What other thoughts on the topic or any other areas of this that you want to explore or dive into in this piece?
I would just say, Jake, that I think that there's a natural reaction right now coming after all the events of last year, right? With Black Lives Matter, a social injustice, the Me Too movement that came in the years prior. And there's a lot of focus, right? We saw some large institutional investors like BlackRock send out letters to their clients and the companies that they invest in, indicating that this is a need for change. We've seen a lot of ESG funds be created, focusing companies on this. And so I think that while there's a natural inclination to want to include it in compensation programs, I think each company really needs to take a step back and make sure that they understand why they're including it, because doing it just because they're told that it's important is not really the right reason to do it. Not everybody has been racing to do this. I think if you looked at the statistics, it's still a vast minority practice. Certainly there are industries that have always had what they would call an E metric, whether that's safety or output or something on the environmental side, especially oil and gas or certain heavy duty industrials and manufacturing. Now the question is, how do we migrate along this entire continuum of ESG, which is a very big thing, right? If you see any company's sustainability report, it's pages upon pages of different metrics and different things that they're working on. This year, for the first time, the SEC is requiring a human capital management disclosure in the 10K. And for the first time, we're going to see a look into some HR policies and practices in a 10K statement. And so I think companies really need to take a step back and identify what they're trying to achieve, how it will best fit into their organization, how it will create meaningful value, and then take some time to figure out when they should implement it. What work do they have to do over the next 11 months during 2021 to set a baseline? How do they want to test their hypothesis on this? How do they want to create the right programs or policies in order to measure something like this, whether that's a satisfaction survey or some other metric? And I do think that if you take my thought about having ESG being a carve out on an LTI plan and a rotation of the E, the S, and the G, you might be able to implement that design for 2022, start with an E metric, which is a little bit more standard and a little bit more understood, and then really introduce the S metric in 2023 and use the time between now and the start of 2023 to really get a grip on what the right S metric is, what your baseline is, and how you're going to measure success.
I love that. Any other thoughts that come to mind? Any other areas you want to explore or add into this?
You keep pressing me, Jake.
You're the expert, so I feel like with the areas.
We might be the experts on compensation, but this is an evolving field. And I do think in some ways I relate this to the trend of use of total shareholder return in programs that we saw a flurry of 10 years ago. When there's a push by the institutional investors and there's a push by your proxy advisors to try to incorporate a new area of focus, there are some early adopters, there are some late adopters, and everybody who adopts it realizes there's better ways to do it than what you first thought was. So I just think that companies shouldn't be rigid here. I think that we should try, and it's okay to try something and not be ultimately perfect on your first attempt. But I think that finding a way to figure out what's going to drive your company forward, finding a way to incorporate it in some fashion, finding a way to make sure that the organization knows that this is important. And sometimes importance is measured by how much compensation is tied to it, fairly or unfairly. But it's okay to try. We just need to be aware of the legal risks and the unintended consequences of doing some of these things, because organizations are organisms that evolve and have lots of things pulling and pushing their initiatives. So we just need to find the right thing here that's going to drive the business forward and not hamper things that a company's trying to achieve.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. Any other additions before we dive into the video portion of things?
No.
Okay. Awesome. The only other question that I'll ask on the writing is if you could summarize in 1 or 2 sentences the key takeaway you want people to have from this article, what would that be?
Repeat your question one more time.
So if you could summarize in 1 or 2 sentences, 1, 2, 3 sentences here, the key takeaway you want someone to have after reading this article, what would that be?
I think that ESG is a hot topic right now because it's an important topic with what's going on in our culture and our society. And it's broader than corporate America, but corporate America plays a role, and compensation in particular plays a role. If you believe in our business at all, you get what you pay for. And alternatively, you don't get what you don't pay for. And so I think that if this is more than just a pressing of certain folks thinking that this is the topic of the day or the right thing at the moment, but people truly believe that this is going to make corporate America better financially, a better place to work, a better place to contribute to society, do better for our ecosystem and our world. If you truly believe that this set of basket of topics is going to drive that, then I think you do have to pay for it in some way, because otherwise people are not going to believe that it truly is important to a company. Because if you're going to pay for EPS and ROIC and share price growth, you're going to get people's attention focused to those things, no matter how much you say this is important.
Awesome. That's phenomenal.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. You can see more about this episode along with additional executive compensation insights at meridiancp.com. That's Meridian, the letter C, and the letter P.com. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com.